research in Central Asia. This third webinar, which is part of the partnership set up by the French Gender Institute with the French research units abroad. As members of the Scientific Council of the French Gender Institute, Mariam Ndiaye and I work together to develop this partnership. So thanks again, Mariam, for that. And we are very pleased to welcome some of the network's correspondents today. Thank you for being here. I want to briefly present the Gender Institute, created exactly 10 years ago. It is a groupement d'intérêt, which is a flexible form of association between universities, research units, and CNRS, interested in federating their skills for the development of research. Its aim is to promote gender studies in all the diversity, to support the scientific recognition, particularly to support young researchers. More recently, the Institute has decided to strengthen its international dimension by setting up a network of correspondents. We wanted to rely on a network of French research units abroad and on the very rich connection with colleagues in the countries where they are based. The Institute of Research for Development is also part of this dynamic. The objective is to make regional meetings online that can have different forms. First example, it can be the place to discuss about the main political issues on gender, taking into account the very contrasting political context around common issues. We did that last spring with the CEFRES, based in Prague, and with the SEMCA, based in Mexico, where I am today. And we did that about gender studies, political conflict, and academic freedom. On this occasion, we have discussed the question of the conservative backlash against gender studies in Hungary, Cameroon, and the question of sexist violence and academic freedom in Mexico. Another example is to focus not on an issue, but on a specific country, to highlight and discuss the gender studies that are developed there. We did that 2 weeks ago with the IFEAC, Nigeria, about history and perspectives for gender studies in this country. And I think today we inaugurate a third way to open discussions for this webinar, which is to bring together different epistemologies on gender studies in one geopolitical space, in this case in Central Asia. More specifically, different researchers will address the articulation and relevance of both decolonial and feminist studies to Central Asia. As you know, for some time now, part of French gender research has been combining feminist, intersectional, and decolonial approaches, but this combination is the target of attacks from reactionary movements within civil society. The legitimacy is also questioned by political representatives such as the Minister of Education or even the President of the French Republic. According to the diagnosis, these approaches lead to secession, cut the Republic in two. They represent, I quote, ethnicization of the social question. This is what President Macron said in private and was reported to the press. And for example, the Minister of Education said publicly that about what he calls intersectional thesis. This is the breeding ground for fragmentation of our society and the vision of the world that converges with the interests of Islamists. This reality has affected a significant part of the French social sciences, end of quote. I could add other facts about academic freedom and the questioning of the practical reality of Republican universalism, or quote other statements in this sense. But the idea here is not to discuss the French situation. I just wanted to emphasize that we are organizing this session in a French context where the association between feminist studies and decolonial studies can be seen at the ferment of separatism. On the contrary, in order to show the diversity of approaches and places in the social sciences where precisely feminist and decolonial studies together propose stimulating historiographical hypothesis and knowledge, and maybe when it is not exactly always about Occident, we have asked Lucia Diramberger to be the scholar of this webinar in partnership with the IFEAC, directed by Adrien Fauve. I will let Adrien introduce himself and IFEAC. Many thanks, Adrien. I also thank Diana Skiba and Eloise Humbert for the precious help for the logistical organization and the communication around the event. And I want to warmly thank the participants, Rose, Madina, Nega, Diana, Moira, but I will let Lucia present them in a few minutes. Lucia, really special thanks to you because you are the scientific architect of this session. Lucia is a research fellow at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in France, unit of gender and sexuality studies in Aubervilliers in sociology. She wrote on the question of gender and nation in Tajikistan. Her work focuses on the links between empires, gender and nations in Central Asia, particularly in Tajikistan. She mobilizes the social relations of gender, class, race, and ethnicity to analyze social hierarchies and the agency of minorities in these societies. Her research focuses the political uses of religion, women's movements, and women's work. She's also interested in the circulation of knowledge on women and gender, some of which is involved in the reformulation of ethno-racial hierarchies. She has written several articles, including Gender and Ethnicity in the Soviet Muslim Peripheries, a feminist post-colonial geography of women's work in the Tajik SSR, with Negar Bezadi in Central Asian Soviet in 2020. Faire naître une nation moderne, Gender, Orientalism and Heteronationalism in 19th century Iran in Raison Politique. And in 2016, Gender and Nation in Post-Soviet Central Asia, published by Cambridge University with Juliette Closiou. Well, as you can see, it is thanks to her collaboration and thorough research that it was possible to set up this magnificent panel today. So thank you again to all of you. Now I leave the floor to Adrien and the IFEAC and Lucia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delphine. Honestly, I must say I'm thrilled. This is a great initiative. And I would like especially to thank IDG, Gender Studies, Gender Institute, and especially Delphine Lacombe for this wonderful opportunity. And of course, my gratitude also goes to Lucia Diramberger, who, as you said, is a permanent CNRS researcher and also associated to IFEAC, where she helps us broadening the scope of our activities. Scholarship on Central Asia is experiencing, I guess, a major trend or turn, which is characterized by feminization and nativization of social science, which means that, at least in my view, and probably this will be discussed, more and more women scholars and Central Asian scholars are actively publishing cutting-edge research on the global scale in this booming field. Maybe this is strange to say, being myself a European male, currently based in Bishkek. Paradoxically enough, tomorrow in the region, there is going to be a celebration of so-called defenders of homeland, which actually relates to a very specific understanding of masculinity. I think such phenomenon needs to be investigated from a post-colonial and feminist point of view in order to problematize Soviet legacies. Today's seminar displays most prominent scholars who are also representative of a very dynamic generation. IFEAC, so the French Institute for Central Asian Studies, based in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, must be honored to be part of this today. We are always ready to support critical thinking, and I cannot wait to learn a lot from today's panelists. Thank you again to IDG Gender Institute and all the colleagues present, and I think now I let the floor to Lucia.
Thank you. I am very happy to introduce this session on the use of post and decolonial feminist studies in and on Central Asia. This session aims to make visible researches which analyze the making of social hierarchies in Central Asia. I would like to begin with this introduction by describing 4 theoretical contributions of post-colonial, decolonial, and feminist studies in Central Asia. First, this research field analyzes the nature of Russian and Soviet empires. It highlights the gender colonial legacies of Tsarist regime during the Soviet era and its aftermath up to now. Second, this research field questions modernity as a paradigm for imperialism. In Soviet ideology, USSR aimed to bring modernity to Central Asia. As the historian Svetlana Gorshinina reminds us, the indicator of modernity was notably electrification, access to social services, development of national culture, and also the decrease of religious practices. This agenda particularly targeted women through politics of unveiling, for instance. After the collapse of USSR, international organizations have also planned massive projects in the region in the name of modernization and women's rights. Third, this literature analyzes women's agency. It reveals how women cope with gendered hierarchies, how they negotiate and resist patriarchy. Fourth, these researches question the production of knowledge on Central Asia. Russian Orientalism has become a research topic. As analyzed by Madina Klostanova, Russian scientists have depicted Central Asian women as backward, illiterate, and secluded. Moreover, as Elena Kim shows, there are ongoing hierarchies of knowledge production, whereby, I quote, non-Western field locations are considered peripheral and only as spaces of data extraction. Saying that, lots of questions remain. One of them, and maybe the most important, is how do we describe social hierarchies without reifying and reproducing marginality? Some post-colonial studies silence Central Asia women's voice and experiences. Some feminist studies overlook ethnicity and race as a power relation. Feminist, decolonial, and post-colonial studies are still mainly produced in Western institutions. Scientific debates among scholars reflect the challenge to analyze the complex process of inequalities and social hierarchies in Central Asia. The participants and the discussants of this session contribute to provide conceptual and empirical answers. Thus, I am so grateful that they have accepted to share their work and excited about the coming discussion. I also would like to thank the French Gender Institute and the French Institute for Central Asian Studies, and particularly Diana Skiba, who made this session possible. Let me introduce the participants. Negar Behzadi is a lecturer at the University of Bristol. She is a political geographer interested in unveiling the ways in which intersectional forms of exclusion and marginalization are produced, reproduced, and contested in stressed environments. Among her publications, we refer here to 2 articles. First one entitled Working Bodies at the Margin, Shame and Agency Among Women Minors in Tajikistan, and the second one, Women Minors, Exclusion and Muslim Masculinities in Tajikistan. Diana Kudai-Bergenova is assistant professor in political sociology at the University of Cambridge. She studies intersections of power relation in the making of state and nation. Her first book, Rewriting the Nation in Modern Kazakh Literature, deals with the study of nationalism, modernization in Kazakhstan. Her second book is entitled Toward Nationalizing Regimes, Conceptualizing Power and Identity in the Post-Soviet Realm. Moira Soyarkulova is an associate professor at the American University of Central Asia. Her previous work was about the relationship between gender and nation in Kyrgyzstan. Her current work deals with women and queer subjectivities and activism in Kyrgyzstan. Most recently, she co-authored a book on happiness for young and not so young, LGBT, but not only people. Moira is credited with Elena Kim, who I quoted earlier, a series of texts on hierarchies within scientific knowledge entitled When Your Field is Also Your Home, Introducing Feminist Subjectivities in Central Asia. Madina Klostanova is a decolonial researcher and a professor of postcolonial feminism at Linköping University. Among her many publications, her book Gender Epistemologies and Eurasian Borderlands was published in 2010. She recently credited a book entitled Postcolonial and Post-Socialist Dialogues, Intersection, Opacities, Challenges in Feminist Theorizing and Practice. Rose Dengue is assistant professor at the Glendon campus of York University. She's a social historian and political scientist working on women's political participation in colonial and post-colonial contexts, especially in Cameroon and in France. She has co-written an article entitled Les féministes des marches peuvent-elles parler? Retour sur un échec académique et ses implications épistémologiques et politiques. Her forthcoming publication is Gender and Citizenship in Africa, Opening Up and Decolonizing Political Science through the lens of Cameroonian women's mobilization. So thank you again. And now, dear Negar, the Zoom session is yours.
Excuse me, Lucia, just maybe a precision about the organization of the session. You will be able to write your question and comments within the thread, and we will pass them to the speakers. And of course, we have the time for a discussion in the last part of the seminar. Thank you.
Okay, great. Can you all see my screen? Perfect, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for having me here today. I'm a delight to be here, and thanks for these great introductions. Before I actually start and get into trying to answer this question that was ascribed to us today, I'd like to start raising 2 points. The first one is that I'm supporting the university college unions at the moment in the UK. We're in industrial strike action that is going on. We've been fighting for years against the deterioration of our pensions, of our working conditions, of our pays, against the gender and ethnic pay gap in the UK, and the casualization of labor with the neoliberalization of universities. And this strike is going on at the moment, and I've decided to still give this seminar as it's organized in France, as it speaks about topics that are also highly political and are close to my heart. But I'd like to voice my support for the strike before I actually go ahead. The second to raise is about my own positionality. So I'm probably the only speaker here with a non-Central Asian scholar. I'm, well, the only person speaking in the panel. I'm French-Iranian. I was born in Iran and grew up in France. And I guess my legitimacy in speaking about questions of decoloniality in Central Asia can therefore be questioned because actually of this history. I did my PhD in the UK. I have an academic position currently in the UK. But I guess the rationale for engaging with these themes stems precisely also from this positionality. I've always somehow felt a deep connection with positions of marginality, maybe because of the color of my skin, because of my name, of the experience of political refuge of my family in France, and also of growing up in a society that is increasingly heteropatriarchal and universalist, and as Delphine very nicely described earlier today. I guess this positionality and where I come from is probably what explained why these theories also really strongly appealed to me. Somehow they feel very embodied. They feel like they're telling a story that is giving a voice to an experience that is very close to my own. Well, this doesn't answer the question of why and how use post-decolonial and feminist theories on and in Central Asia. That is at the heart of this panel discussion. I guess there is a lot to unpack in this question and lots of different terms. We're speaking about post-colonialism, decolonialism, and feminism. And each of these bodies of theories are bodies of theories in their own right. I guess using them together raises questions about what links these different bodies of work, approaches to knowledge production, but also what distinguishes them. And I think a discussion of this goes slightly beyond the scope of our discussion today. But I guess some elements of answers will run through what I'm going to speak about, and I'm sure what others are going to speak about today. But I'm going to try attempt an answer. And I guess for me, in a nutshell, my answer will be that these different bodies of work overlap and share very similar objectives. The first one is a critique of forms of epistemic erasures and a dedication to give voice to forms of knowledges or people who have traditionally been erased from knowledge production in Western academia, Western European modes of knowledge production. And I guess probably here in the context of Central Asia, we need to add in Russian academia. The second one is an engagement with forms of marginalized knowledges and knowers. The third one, a dedication to make a difference visible in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, class, but also other axes of difference. And finally, a desire to challenge, transform these epistemic and practical injustices and try to revert relations of power. What makes a feminist decolonial approach, according to me, different from a feminist only or a post-colonial only approach is up for grabs. I think this is something that we're still discussing in the field. But for me, running through this presentation, there are three main points that I'd like to speak about. The first is that I think that the feminist decolonial approach, maybe versus a feminist only or post-colonial only approach, needs to engage with the theme of intersectionality, but not intersectionality as a mere description of axes of difference, but as shaped throughout history, in the past, and existing and reproduced in the colonial present, rather than solely focusing on women or gender relations in a detached analytical way. So I'm thinking about a political statement, and one also that recognized the historicized and geographical nature of intersectionality and the production of hierarchies. So moving beyond flat analysis of intersectionalities. Second, I think that a feminist decolonial approach entails the recognition that relations of coloniality have shaped the past, but are still active in the heterosexist, racist, and capitalist present. Third, according to me, a feminist decolonial approach is not only political in its analysis, and I think this is where there is still so much work to do. So it's not just about making visible relations of power. I think it should be also a political in the way it attempts to do academia differently. I'm speaking about ways of writing, about ways of speaking, who writes, in which language, which format, and what types of healing, and I'm borrowing the word of the Maori decolonial scholar, Linda Tuai-Smith, when I speak about this idea of healing, we are making possible through the process of writing. So I'm far from having done all of this. I think it's a work in progress, and one that I think will take a very long time. But what I'd like to do now is to start engaging with ways I've tried to think about these themes in my own work. How can we engage with feminism, postcolonialism, and decolonialism in works in and on Central Asia, and why it's important? Starting with co-authored work with Lucia Durand-Berger that Delphine mentioned earlier today. Lucia was chairing the seminar today. Work that we research about women workers in Central Asia. So years ago, Lucia and I realized that a lot of the academic research on gender in Tajikistan, which is where both of our research work focuses, spoke about women during the contemporary periods. But that there was a kind of black box about the Soviet past. So there were assumptions about themes of unemployment, norms restricting women's work today in Tajik society, marriage, divorce, migration, addressed in very thorough terms by social scientists. But we didn't necessarily have a strong baseline. We didn't have an understanding of how the Soviet past had actually shaped the contemporary present. There is quite a bit of research on neighboring countries during the Soviet periods, but there was a question mark around what had happened in Tajikistan. And what Lucia and I tried to offer in this article was to think about what a feminist post-colonial perspective could bring, in particular, to our understanding of women's work in the Soviet past. Why work? Because work was central to the Soviet modernization project. with the idea that the integration of women into the labor force will contribute to cultural modernization and move away women from the status of backwardness. And today we evidence that in lots of parts of Tajikistan, there are still restrictions of women's labor with, in rural areas, for instance, people considering women's work as inappropriate. Yet women were actively working, even in rural areas where they were socialized to work in agricultural collective farms, for example, and in various industries. So there was really a paradox here that we wanted to make sense of. And we found actually elements of response in bringing a post-colonial perspective, a feminist post-colonial perspective. And for us, in this work, thinking about the post-colonial perspective went beyond thinking about if we should look at the Soviet endeavor as being purely colonial or not colonial, if we could compare the Soviet presence as a form of empire, which has been largely discussed in very interesting ways. But what was interesting for us was to first acknowledge that using some post-colonial concepts could allow us to make visible some of the complexity of the Soviet project. And Lucia mentioned it, that the Soviet project was decolonial in principle. I mean, the Bolshevik Revolution was actually founded on this idea of decoloniality, moving away from the Tsarist period. But actually, in practice, through exercise of like modernization and this idea of development, reproduced some forms of hierarchies, gendered and ethnic hierarchies in this case, that have been ingrained in the past and that also still shape the present moment. What we found is that using post-colonial concepts such as hybridity, third space, were actually very useful to look at the ambivalence of the Soviet presence in Central Asia. Third, it was also about giving voice to specific actors. Methodologically, our work focused on former workers, so female workers who were like many older women, but also some men who recollected the Soviet times, often in rural areas. People who were really willing to share their experiences and their living memories of the Soviet period. So our work was about recording these living memories that are often forgotten in what we define history. In this case, the voice of older women who only spoke Tajik, for lots of them. Fourth, also, it's also about when we investigate policies and looking at work policies, looking at female Tajik intellectuals and their scientific production and perspectives on labor at the time, and revaluing knowledge in what we wrote. For us, it was important to make visible these voices and to acknowledge the type of gender and ethnic hierarchies that the Soviet presence had created. And in doing so, to start challenging something that is a little bit of a taboo when we speak about Central Asian contexts, the ways in which the Soviet presence created forms of ethnic hierarchies with, in this case, the Russians being seen as the modernized superiors versus Muslim Central Asian women. So what was important was for us to make visible this type of violence. The second example I'd like to give to answer the question of why and how we use post-decolonial and feminist theories in Central Asia draws on another aspect of my work that I have developed. So most of my research in Tajikistan has focused on a mining village in the Sud province of Tajikistan, Kante, in the village of Kante. So in this village of 1,500 inhabitants, so this village lies on one of the largest coal reserves in the country. Male and female, and also children engaged with mining and live in this fragmented extractive landscape. So since the fall of the Soviet Union, lots of different forms of livelihoods have emerged, including informal artisanal mining, but also formal industrial mining in a local Sino-Tajik mine and male seasonal migration to Russia. But all the inhabitants in this place do not experience these new forms of labor in the same way. So villagers see often male migrants and informal miners as strong and proud, but they consider women's work in mine as aib, shameful. And the women who mine usually mine in a hidden area, and those occupying the worst positions are actually the young female miners who are reaching the conventional age of marriage, which is 17 and 18. And unlike adult women, these women are allowed to mine in their men, but their work also bears a cost, which is to compromise their future prospects. So what I've done in my work is that I try to examine the gender threats and experiences of exclusion that have appeared in this place with the emergence of a post-socialist, capitalist, and extractive landscape. So I considered the threat of coal disappearing under the villagers' feet and its impact in terms of resource access and distribution, but I also wanted to explore the threat of the material and social exclusion of women miners in general and young female miners in general. So what I've done in this work is that I asked what a feminist decolonial approach, and in particular a feminist decolonial political ecology approach can offer in terms of understanding of these gendered exclusions. So drawing on the voices of young female mimers, what I showed is that a decolonial political ecology approach enables a rhetoricization of ideas of gendered exclusion beyond culturalist approaches that actually look at exclusion as being ingrained in cultures of honor and shame, for instance. But looking at how the systemic, the context of neoliberalization and of resources in Tajikistan has made this situation possible. So I've tried to develop a systemic analysis of gendered exclusion as a form of intersectional violence that was embedded in what I refer to as ecologies of exhaustion, which for me is an inherent feature of extractive capitalism that is based on first, on a simultaneous and dialectical fatigue and double exhaustion, a productive exhaustion of land, of resources, and in parallel, a reproductive exhaustion of women's bodies. And what I try to show is that within this system, all bodies are actually not exhausted in the same way, and that the rise of extractive capitalism fragments landscapes by variously reinforcing existing axes of difference, but also shaping new ones. In the context of this village, the fragmentation of this village permits the intimate geographies of the most vulnerable women, in this case, young, the poorest of the poorest, underclassed, female, rural Tajikistanis. So why is it important to adopt a feminist decolonial approach here? So for me, it's first about going beyond culturalist approaches to gender relations and the way they frame economic relations in places. It's about thinking about how these norms are actually embedded in a broader system of exclusion and violence that goes hand in hand with the privatization and neoliberalization of resources. The setting up of a Sino-Tajik mine in the village of Kante exhausts lands, but it also exhausts bodies, and the bodies of the poorest, youngest women in these rural areas. Second, it's about looking at the way this happens intersectionally, but with an understanding of intersectionality as more than just a description of axes of difference, but as created through these capitalist relations of production. And finally, it's again about the politics of voice, whose voices allow us to make this visible. In this case, we're speaking about young women in rural areas who are working in mines and who are stigmatized for it. So I'd like to conclude here by saying that I think that using a feminist, post and decolonial approach in Central Asia, for me, goes beyond thinking about the colonial nature of the Soviet endeavor. It's about trying to make visible and challenge relations of power and thinking about who we do research with. In my case, this has involved working in Tajik with women, men, and children, informal workers in rural areas mainly. I think that obviously there are important questions that arise when we think about the politics of voice, and the feminist philosopher Linda Alcoff long ago advocated for speaking alongside and with others rather than pretending speaking for others. And as much as I agree with this, I also feel very limited in doing so. The Maori scholar Linda T.Y. Smith reminds us, however, that it's not because these voices are imperfect that they should not be heard, that we should stop doing research. She says that in the context of work with indigenous peoples, that's not because research has long been associated with violence and even genocide. It should not be done anymore. It should, however, be done differently. And I think this raises question and a whole set of new questions that I don't have the space to engage with today, but I'd like to use as an opening about methodologies and how we do research. How as researchers, we try to tell stories differently. An attempt of actually telling these stories differently can be found in my own work with a feminist animation artist. So 2 years ago, Kate Jessup with this artist and myself, drew on an ethnographic portrait of one stigmatized coal miner in the village of Kente to produce a short animation piece about experiences of shame. So with the idea of actually moving away from academic writing to have a story that was extremely simple and very accessible. So I'm going to stop here now with this question, I guess, about like methodologies. I think you're on mute, Lisa.
Your microphone.
Sorry, thank you very much, Nega. Thank you. Diana, if you want to begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nega. I'm actually going to pick up exactly where you left, even though it wasn't really planned, but I think this discussion is so fascinating that I do pick up from there. And actually, I wanted to start my presentation, but it's not really a presentation. I think it's an intervention in a type of dialogue, or precisely as what we do is work in progress in general. And I actually wanted to start with saying that what we do, or at least what I do in my practice, is not so much of the research, but it's about writing together with the community I'm engaging with. And it's also not writing about these people, but writing with them. And I could see that a lot of them are currently in the participation list. I see a lot of people who have been engaged for quite some time in what I write, and I really want them to know as well, and they know that we are writing these texts together, and so it's more important that they're producing the discourses, and we're all trying to engage in talking about them more. And I'm really thankful to them for being there and being so powerful in what they produce. But also, I think it's a very interesting and important aspect of methodology as well, because I know a number of writers in this particular topic, and I want to mention them, like Julia Ten, for example, and Ksenia Udot, two feminist writers from Astana. They're the graduates of Nazarbayev University, and they've written fantastic dissertations that I've looked at in terms of discussing this particular gender field. And they actually do this very much active participation of writing together with the community, which I think is also very, very important. I'm also standing with the UCU today. We are striking. I do have my pin somewhere. I'm supporting this strike, and I'm supporting all the people who are under these conditions. And today, really what I'm presenting is so much of a dialogue, because for me, the question of why is already answered. It's not so much of, why we do it. We are already doing it. The field is already doing it. Again, a number of fantastic scholars whose names I won't mention, but you can just open the participant list and you can see all of them are there. I hope you hear me. We are all in this together. We are all already doing and using decolonial frames to study gender relations and study very power structures and violence structures in our particular region. So you're all there. For me, the question today would be more of sort of like how we do it, because it's a very much of a constant work in progress. It's constant idea of also, not being objectified, but also trying to unravel and talk about the violent stories where we were objectified, or our grandmothers, or their cultures and the histories were objectified. And sort of brought into this very particular and stranded taxonomy of what they had to represent or what they had to be, and they couldn't really move away from these taxonomies. So I think it's very, very important. And also, I think in doing sort of decolonial gender studies in Central Asia, we're also very much in this relational field together. We're constantly in discussions, but also criticisms to each other, which I think is a very important point as well. And I'm always thankful to those critiques coming from the field, from friends, from colleagues, from other people, because we constantly read and write together, which I think is very important. And I'm usually mostly grateful to the critiques, because I think it's very, very important to be in checkpoints of how we do things and what we're particularly looking into. So today I'm going to, of course, it's a big question of where we're going to look in discussing the decolonial frame, but I'm only going to focus on particular critiques that came out, and I'm going to highlight some of the contentious points that I think are very important in how we go about and what we do with this in the future. And I think from given, and I'm going to mainly talk today about Kazakhstan, but of course, if there are questions, I would love to speak about other places as well, where I do my fieldwork. But Kazakhstan in particular, I think, has a very interesting decolonial art movement that I'm very much, engaged with and working with, not on. the collective of Artcom, for example, and Agirim Kapar, who's doing fantastic work behind producing all sorts of different forms of decolonial art and practices, very, very important. So because Suleimanova is today in the audience, Medina Bazargali as well, those people who I really want to mention, sort of highlight, these are very important voices who bring that particular perspective together. But also there are a lot of, feminist writers' voices, as I mentioned, Ksenia Udot, Yulia Ten, Altan Kambekova, again, I would need to look up more names from the top of my head. But I think what we're really engaging with is this, it's a very complex idea of what we see as colonial. And I think there is a very much deep understanding of double coloniality of knowledge. It's not only the coloniality of knowledge that comes from the Western perspective and sort of, the Western empires, but it's also the coloniality of Sovietness, and how do we define what is this coloniality of Sovietness, which we very clearly heard yesterday in the speech, in a very famous speech, and we will, of course, we'll take time to rethink a lot of these discourses and narratives as well. But I think what's also very, very important, that's what I'm looking into in my own particular work, is how this particular taxonomy of, for example, ethnicity and gender in itself created and sort of it reinforced by a particular regime of truth during Soviet period, then transformed into what we're seeing in the post-Soviet period. And it's not so much of a clear sort of linear perspective of how it happened, but nevertheless, we can see that current regimes that are called nationalizing regimes in my particular country are using this gendered order in order to create or recreate and reinforce these particular taxonomies and categories and understandings, which really chain down particular people into who they have to be, how do they represent their lives, how do they live, and what are their values, and so on. And unfortunately, these very sort of violent and powerful perspectives are also moving into the social text as well. We see a lot of contentions and definitions in terms of the sexuality, in terms of gender. The idea of Yacht that I'm going to talk about today, the shame, is very, very important as well. And it's a very contentious point of how do we analyze it in itself within all these discourses and discussions that are ongoing. And the idea, which I think is very, very important, out of that very much political perspective of separating into male and female, into creating a very much heteronormative perspective on gender, where, for example, Kazakhstan's own policy on gender is always about women and family, and it's in a very particular paternalistic way, which is also heteronormative, where the attention is so much paid into this idea of reproduction and femininity rather than the political participation and rights and sort of the violence against gendered violence against women, which is also very important and remains an important point that we need to highlight and fight for. And I think out of that, sort of from this very rigid regime perspective, comes this idea of contentions on social level, where people are seeking, all sorts of groups and people are seeking, their own questions of who we are, where are we going, how do we understand our past, how do we understand these categories that we were left with. And I think the category of ethnicity in itself has to be very much criticized and sort of deconstructed, and we need to analyze it further. But again, we just, in the beginning, we're just questioning these things, which are very, very important. And it's very hard to come up with the answers right away, obviously, that's the problem. So that's the complexity. But I think what emerges from this debate is this idea of, which is again, binary, but not binary in the sense that it should be like that, but unfortunately it's presented as binary precisely because it's grounded in this coloniality and coloniality of knowledge as well. And this binary, quite interestingly, is not about traditionalism and being modern, because Soviets made, according to the logic and according to the discourse, Soviets made everybody modern, but it's the idea of traditionalist versus civilized, which I see quite a lot. And that's, again, one of the points of contention that I think we really need to pay attention to and look deeper into to provide the critique. So what is this traditionalist versus civilized? It is also coupled with the idea of sort of neoliberalism, the idea of exploitation, and on top of that, very much gendered perspective and very much sort of looking through the lenses of women. Although I think men are also very important, or queer people also very important in sort of breaking this binary and breaking this very sort of violent and narrow perspective. So, and this traditionalist versus civilized, I think it's a very interesting perspective to look into what does it mean to be traditional. So again, stemming from the Soviet, early Soviet attack on local Central Asian cultures, it's the idea of backwardness. It's the idea of not being, urban enough, not sustaining to particular values. And what is interesting is that in post-Soviet perspective, these values are also highly neoliberalized and globalized. So that the idea of being civilized is basically being the global consumer of a particular neoliberal order and fitting into that particular neoliberal order with your own body and with your own values and again, consumption. And in this, so versus this, like, in contrast to the civilized perspective, there is this traditionalist vein where, in the negative terms, it is seen as sort of, backward, but also repressive against women. Here we're talking about this sort of tradition perspective of gelin, daughter-in-law. We're talking about the discourses and tensions within the family relations themselves, where women are considered to be repressed within the paternalistic and sort of patriarchal order. But also, I think what is also very important, there is this highly contested idea of the mother-in-law, who's also becoming, in certain studies, and I've seen that, is becoming almost like the player within the patriarchal system herself, even though she's sort of a woman. And there, sort of in the critique of this traditionalist perspective, in the very negative sense, it is seen as a point of repression, as a point, again, as I said, of backwardness, but also exploitation of particular gendered labor. And sort of contrary to that, there are people who are arguing that there's nothing wrong in respecting traditions, especially if people are doing it voluntarily. There's nothing wrong in, if you want to follow the particular repressive or biased perspective of womanhood, then why not, and so on. But it also talks about marginalization. And I think when we're looking into very sort of binary perspective, we're buying into it, we're really looking at it from the Soviet perspective, again, of this coloniality, of seeing everything local or traditional as backward, which I think is very problematic. Whereas we really need to look at it from the decolonial perspective into the idea of what type of knowledges were not allowed to be spoken about at the time, and what type of framework did we inherit to look through, in particular to recreate this binary that is coming very much from the Soviet colonial perspective, but also look into the neoliberal exploitation that is at play here as well, which I think is very, very important in my forthcoming work, where I look into why and how during the collapse of socialism, a lot of, if we look into the sort of the level of unemployment, it was highly gendered. It was women who were very much losing their jobs and were sort of pushed in many ways, both by the regimes, by the particular cultural, well, not cultural, but particular social conditions, to turn into very much exploitative labor, and also very precarious conditions of the labor markets. So we really, really need to look into the complexity of how these definitions, how these binaries come together. When I move to the idea of, to the next category, the idea of sexuality, that's also very much important, because traditionalism, and this, again, if we look at it under this very much debatable framework of traditionalism, we really need to look into sexuality as also because it does frame in the social discourse a particular behavior and a particular expectation of a woman, especially a ethnicized woman, of how she should be behaving and what she should do with her sexuality and her body. And that's where the idea of Yacht comes out very strongly. In my work on sort of the social media perspective and how this is debated and discussed, for example, on Instagram, which is one of the most popular social media platforms in Kazakhstan, and very much, Yacht is discussed very much online, highly through this prism, again, of female sexuality. Most of the times there's very little about male sexuality. And it's also very much, shame is discussed through this idea of both marital sexual life, but also outside marital sexual life, in terms of the shame of not marrying a virgin is still a big thing as well. And in these discussions, in these very complex discussions, there are, like, at the time, thousands of people debating and chatting about it online, which is very important. The discourse that they're constructing is still within this frame of very much coloniality of what a particular ethnicized female body represents, what a particular ethnicized woman, what are the values that she should be behaved according to. And it's really forming this particular sort of gendered order, where I wouldn't say that women are victimized, because I'm a strong opponent of that, but nevertheless are seen in the submissive and repressive position. And again, on top of that, they're also seen as being traditionalist and thus backward, which is a very much, as I say, a deeper reflection of what the Soviets brought up with the idea of, again, colonizing and exotifying the women of the East, Vostok, which is, I think, very, very important. And in coupled with that is this sort of, with a very clear cut taxonomy of these ideas, of these values. I think it's very important that there is also an hierarchy where, of course, class plays into a huge role in sort of in these hierarchies and in the ways that women can liberate themselves from these particular sort of taxonomies and ideas. Another thing that plays into it is, of course, sort of the idea of participation and working, and how can you work with these particular ideas and so on. But I think what's problematic for me, and the critique that I'm particularly drawn into, is this idea of how can we sort of go beyond these binaries? How can we go beyond and sort of even complexify the idea of shame itself? Because Yacht, as some of the critiques are talking about, is not so much of this linear perspective of backwardness or shame seen as a very gendered perspective, solely directed against women, which is somehow that's where the discourse is moving towards at the moment. And I completely agree with this critiques, is that Yacht has always been a very important cultural notion within Kazakh culture that is often forgotten in these discussions. But it's forgotten not only, again, going back to this idea of double coloniality and sort of the influence of different forces here. It's forgotten because of the complexity that is at play, and because of the binary that plays out of traditionalist and civilized or modern, and being the consumer of a particular globalized order, where the more civilized you are, the less you have or pay attention to Yacht, which I think is very, very problematic and important to shape. In that sense, I think, again, I'm paying attention to the critiques here, and I wanted to highlight these two ideas, and I'm really open to discuss this further, sort of like, how do we explore the particular sexuality? Why this idea of Wallace, sort of a very heteronormative idea of marrying the virgin and being the sort of, how to say, being the, I forgot the word, being faithful to your particular family and serving your family. It really comes from this patronal colonial perspective where women are used as again, bodies that reproduce, but also bodies that are used as precarious labor within the household, which I think is very important. Whereas when we look into some of the findings, and that's what I'm particularly interested in, historical and archival findings, there was not within the Kazakh culture, if you want to look at it like that, both in pre-colonial terms and in the colonial times as well. There was a lot more of an exploration of both female and male sexuality. There was a lot more exploration and less attention paid to, for example, to the idea of virginity, which we see there. And Yacht itself had a very distinct understanding and a very distinct category and where it was applied. And it was definitely not as strictly gendered and not strictly focused on particular women. So I think, in doing the work ahead of us is really looking and paying attention to this complexity, but looking into how these complexities emerge both from the Soviet order and the Soviet gendered order that it brought with it, and taxonomies that it created. And for me, I mean, maybe somebody will start to troll me or throw rotten tomatoes at me, but even the whole idea of ethnicity is highly problematic. And how do we need to sort of deconstruct and break away from this particular idea is very, very important and interesting to explore in the future. But the understanding of what the nationalizing regime does with the ethnicity and how it creates these even stronger taxonomies and directions, sort of where it's hard to escape from them. I think it's also very important, particularly within the gendered order that the regime in Kazakhstan is creating at the moment, in this almost ideal type of a Kazakh woman, the Kazakh mother, the gelin, the daughter-in-law. Again, which in itself, the gelin in itself, I don't think should be the problematic notion, but nevertheless, as we see in the discourse that are coming up, even in pop culture, is very, very important that it's seen precisely from this very colonial repressive subject. So, but also last point that I wanted to raise, if I have 2 minutes left, I think that what's very, very important is that, as I said, there is a huge exploration of these themes in the decolonial art. Artists themselves are here listening in, and I'm sure they can say a lot more about it themselves, but it's this idea of sort of moving beyond these categories and questioning these categories a lot more, and maybe in many ways radicalizing them and pushing for different deconstruction that I think is very, very important. Why it happens particularly in art, why Kazakh art and contemporary art is so important in analyzing these processes. Madina Plastanova wrote a fantastic book that I have on the table over there already, What Does It Mean to Be Post-Soviet? And she discussed it there in length. But also, it's, I guess, it's the space of liberation. It's a space where these particular power structures are questioned and radicalized, because artists in the end are the ones who are able to ask these questions. And I hope, and I can see already that the questions they are asking are traveling quite further away in the cultural production field itself, through the poetry, through some of the films that we're seeing being produced, and so on and so forth. But my worry about it is that, I guess, just seeing that it shouldn't be again closed down to particular taxonomies, but instead of that, in terms of, like, you know, ethnicity itself, what does it mean to have national culture? What are the limits of particular national culture? How do we question the content and form of it? And also the complexity of what is this post-Sovietness that we all sort of rambling and getting through together, which is, I think, was also very important. And what I'm also very, very cautious about is not to close down to and not to question the very Soviet understanding of gender and the very Soviet understanding of womanhood as well, because there are a lot of more complex stories within, within this field in general, and within the distinct and diverse bodies that exist, and who may not always apply to either the very clear-cut understanding of ethnicity or the very clear-cut understanding of gender. So this is my work in progress. And I wanted to make the talk in a way of a dialogue and discussion. These are the things I think that I'm very, very interested in to discussing further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to say that Nega has a technical issue, but she will come back as soon as possible. I think that she's, yeah. And thank you very much, Diana. So Moira, if you want to begin, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Lucia, and thanks for organizing this event. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. So I guess my contribution today will be more me speaking from my experience of being engaged, not just in academic research, but also in gender activism and feminist work here in Kyrgyzstan. So I'll start with the question of why. In the activist circles, increasingly in the past several years, there have been calls for decolonization of gender activism and feminist discourse in Central Asia. I am, for instance, involved in, I'm on the organizing committee of the International Women's Day March for the past several years. And as probably some of you are aware, in the past years, the march has been banned. It has been attacked by nationalist groups affiliated with the police. Yeah, the organizers and participants of the march were detained, and the perpetrators still are not punished. And we were actually fined for disrupting public order. So we were seen as, at fault. And yeah, so last year when we were preparing for the march again, the authorities tried to ban it, but we still marched, and it went okay. There was no violence, but in the aftermath, there was this discussion about the presence of a red flag at the event. So our march was joined by a group called the Kyrgyz Sots. So it's a socialist circle. It's young people who organize, Marxist book readings, book clubs and discussions. They engage in other types of activism, and they also created a SOCFEM, like a socialist feminist circle, which also joined the march. So, they carried their own banners, and they also brought a big red flag with the hammer and the sickle to the event. So many women, the critics said that this is unacceptable, and this is a symbol of totalitarianism, and this is a feminist celebration, so there is no place for a red flag there. Others responded that 8th of March is historically a socialist day, right? So again, it was initiated by socialist women, and it's also kind of a legacy of the Soviet Union, very much like the 23rd of February. So we have this series of very gendered holidays that are celebrated in this period of time. So basically, this is an ongoing discussion that is happening within the movement. So people are saying that we should be affirming like the genuine, authentic Kyrgyz feminism, and we should be speaking the right language, that we should be speaking the language that is understandable to the masses. And generally the people who organize the march are seen as somehow out of touch, and not genuinely representing somehow Kyrgyz society. So in this understanding of like decolonizing feminism, it often kind of implies decommunization, right? And to as a leftist and like a scholar of critical theories, it's strange because historically the idea of decoloniality has this genealogy in leftist politics and ethics, and yeah, so decolonial feminism strives to overcome the gender, race, class, sexuality oppression, which is perceived to originate in the colonial legacy, and which continues to be entrenched in the capitalist world system of power, right? But in the local, oftentimes, interpretation, it becomes kind of hijacked by groups that are nationalist, or that want to kind of make peace with nationalists, and kind of flirt with and want to play this kind of authenticity game. So another example, this past weekend, I was asked to conduct a training for trainers for a local project. It's a local activist project for village girls. So it's women who themselves come from outside of the capital. They come from the different parts of the country originally, but thanks to educational opportunities that were actually offered to them by various colonial powers, they could kind of achieve success, and now they have this project where they conduct trainings and kind of like career advice sessions for other village girls. And so when we were meeting each other, I asked them to tell me about their activism and how they would themselves characterize their activism. So what they said was that they consider themselves non-aggressive feminists, or they do non-aggressive activism. And they specifically told me that they don't go to march, on the International Women's Day. And so they told me, yeah, your opponent is, this group called Kırkçoro. And we work with their children, right? And they also were very concerned about being associated with, this NGO stuff. They really didn't want to be perceived as some kind of foreign agents, right? All this while being financed by Western foundations, and also being kind of these role models, thanks to educational opportunities that they were offering, in like foreign exchange programs. They're all alumnus of like the universities funded by, the American government, Turkish government, or Russian government. So at the same time, the march is organized by groups of most marginalized women. So it's, LGBT, it's lesbians, bisexual, queer, trans women. It's, sex workers, women who use drugs. It's, it's a very diverse group of people who work with, they work in crisis centers, in shelters. They provide like community support. So very grassroots initiative of activists. We are all non-paid volunteers, and we categorically don't accept any foreign funding. So it's entirely kind of self-driven. But meanwhile, we are perceived as, foreign agents and women who are not authentically, Kyrgyz or Central Asian. While decolonial feminism calls us to analyze global development projects with suspicion and like sensitivity towards larger axis of power relations, it's really interesting how all of that plays out in practice, in my experience. So to the question of how, when we also talk about the decolonization of knowledge and knowledge production, and Diana and some other colleagues, we wrote this series of articles for Open Democracy, where we reflected on these issues. When we talk about decolonization of knowledge and knowledge production, I think oftentimes there is a tendency to kind of psychologize this and to think of it as a kind of individual project of like liberating our individual minds from the prejudice or the epistemic habits that we've acquired through our education. But to me, it's not just something that can be achieved through the power of your will or through some kind of self psychoanalytic work that you can do, and reflection, although that's also an important maybe part of the process. But what is often hidden is the larger political economy of knowledge production, of how knowledge production is organized and financed, and how opportunities are created. And, even if you do want, for instance, to produce a book in Russian, that would be accessible to people in Central Asia, it's really hard, for instance, to convince people with the money and such projects that it's a worthwhile thing to do. So, I'm talking specifically about a project that we've been trying to find funding for with a colleague. So we want to publish a book on everyday lives of LGBT people in Central Asia, and we want it to be in regional languages, right, and not in English. So nobody is interested in financing this kind of endeavor. So basically, that's a kind of a challenge that we all have to deal with. And so decolonial feminism also calls us to reflect on identity of researchers as a kind of an inevitable point of departure, which shapes our interests, observations, and responses. So to me, it's been very liberating personally to not pretend that I'm some kind of disembodied, rational mind that is just trying to do objective science, but to recognize my subjectivity and positionality, as a a queer woman who was born in Tajikistan and then lived in Uzbekistan and then now lives in Kyrgyzstan, and so all these multiple and complex identities that I have. So in this sense, decolonial feminist calls us to see knowledge production as a political act, or to rather acknowledge that it's a political act, because it always is, right? But it's just not recognized as such. And to think about who does our research benefit, what is ultimately the point of doing research. And I was really happy to learn about, for instance, your animation film, Negar, because I think that's also kind of the path that I'm gravitating towards, is to produce more non-academic outputs from my research, because I think academia has a real problem in terms of understanding the point of doing research, like and the intended audience of our work. Like several years ago, I read this article that said that on average an article is read by 6 people, and so and then it really led to some major existential crisis for me, because those 6 people probably maybe they didn't even read it, maybe they just cited it to advance their own research agendas and advance their own academic careers. So they didn't actually learn from it. They didn't really inform any action or knowing how also the whole academic publishing industry is a neoliberal racket machine. It really made me think about why am I doing what I'm doing? What's the point of this? And so, writing for feminist zines and for, Samizdat publications, and, producing popular books and, things like that, I think has potential to have bigger impact than many academic publications. I think it's very important for us to think also not only how we do research, but also why we do research and what happens to it afterwards. Yeah, so and I also see liberation as the necessary mission of decolonial feminist activism and scholarship. I see decolonial feminism as a radical emancipatory project that challenges the universalism of Eurocentric feminism. And it calls us to reinterpret history with like a critical look towards modernity and its intrinsically racist and Eurocentric nature. So some of the strategies for such decolonial reinterpretation of history, in my mind, would be, reimagination, resignification, and reappropriation. Yeah, and I think I was really inspired by this idea from Maria Lugones' work, where she writes about purity and impurity. And so she has this, she uses mestizaje, I think is how you pronounce it, as like an example and metaphor for impurity and resistance. And she uses also like this metaphor of curdling, right? So it's like an intersectional practice of resistance that works against the oppressive logic of purity. So I think that's, that's the impulse that I also have, because oftentimes the way that decolonizing agenda is appropriated in the context that I work in, kind of strives towards this idea of authenticity and purity and unity, which to me sounds like a perfect kind of fascist phantasm. And I really see, our complex hybrid post-colonial identities and just our living and being as this, having this really strong potential to become kind of a practice of resistance. So the, it can be about gender transgression, it can be about, multilingual experimentation. It can, so examples of such work we see, for instance, in in home theater in Tashkent, for instance, where I grew up, or in the work of my dear comrades and friends, Maria Vilkarisky and Ruthi Chandrabekova, who are the founders of the Creolex Center in Kazakhstan, now in Austria, and many other examples of this kind of work of reimagining and reinterpreting our past and imagining our futures. So I guess I'll stop here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Again, for the three of you, it was very exciting, and thank you very much. So maybe Madina, if you want to begin the discussion.
It's interesting, very interesting, but you are so different. And I was thinking how to put it all together. And I'm sorry, I was teaching all morning today, so I don't think very clearly. So you have to excuse me. Yeah, I mean, first thing that I was really surprised was how this idea of decoloniality and decolonizing everything is really mushrooming. because I think all of you meant something different by decolonial and decoloniality from what I was able to gather listening to you. And I was thinking of all of these many trajectories of how people construct their idea of coloniality and decoloniality, or colonial decolonizing. And of course, most of them don't connect with how I see decoloniality, let's say, right? But it doesn't mean that one is correct and the other is wrong. But I was just trying to imagine why you come to such an understanding of what decolonial means. And then, of course, we know that nobody owns decoloniality. We can't say that there is one correct way of looking at it, right? So it's actually very interesting to listen to how you reinvent decoloniality in connection with your practice, in connection with what you are actually doing. And that was fascinating to me, fascinating to listen to this. And for instance, in Nigar's presentation, when you were mentioning Linda D.Y. Smith, I was thinking, yeah, I mean, this is considered to be a classical work, of course, but for instance, if we take the school of decoloniality, which is Latin American, right? In that school, we don't consider her as a decolonial feminist because she's seen more as an indigenous person who was actually much before all of this talk about decoloniality emerged in the 90s, because she published her book much before that. But the way the book is done, the way it's made, to me, I mean, it's fascinating, but it's also a thing in itself, in the sense that you cannot easily kind of take these ideas or the suggestions in the book and transport them to other contexts. It's very hard, I think, because it's very much, engaged and engrossed in that specific environment. And in any case, I think that indigeneity is a very separate discourse. And it actually connects to the conversation in the last presentation by Mohira about authenticity and this purity and impurity. Because for me, of course, Maria Lugones is the preeminent decolonial feminist, and my dear friend who unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. And for Maria, it was indeed always very problematic to speak about this going back to the past, to authenticity, to some imaginals. No, she was not about that. Her whole life actually testified that decoloniality is not about nationalism and not about, trying to kind of, return to something. Although this is a very kind of common cliche, if you look at how people talk and what they write today, not only in Central Asia, but actually in much more global context. For example, there are a lot of post-colonial scholars who are, they are sort of criticizing decolonial thinkers. And very often the argument that they use against us, let's say, is that we kind of drag people back to the past, that we don't like to talk about the present and the future. And our intention is to go to the past, which is, of course, not true. If you read carefully Lugones, and if you read carefully other people, and especially the younger generation of decolonial feminists. So that for me was interesting, how all of the three talks intersected, or sometimes maybe did not intersect, on how you see and what do you mean by the colonial feminist approach. And I think it's actually maybe worth thinking also when you go on with your research of how you understand it. I was thinking like, yes, of course, in some contexts, this not going back, but reimagining what was erased is very important, because you deal with contexts in which it was not allowed to actually have any traces of the culture. But it's certainly not the case with the Soviet Union and with the Central Asian republics, because instead of erasing, there was, as you know better than myself, there was a tendency to sort of, replace these national cultures with some, made up Soviet kind of, maybe caricaturistic forms of them that were also ideologically correct. And that was the problem here, that this Soviet project of decolonization, because that's how they presented themselves, the Bolsheviks, that they were decolonizing. But in fact, what happened, of course, was a recolonization in very specific ways, like, okay, we'll give you this and this and this, we'll allow you to get an education, or, you know, to be, you know, open in public, but get some jobs that you were not allowed to do maybe before. But then it was not just like that. It was a price for that, right? Because you were also brainwashed into a certain way of looking at things. And at the same time, when I say this, I'm not criticizing maybe the idea of socialism as such. Rather, it's what we had instead of it, right? Because there is a gap between, you know, state socialism or any socialism as an ideal and how it was realized in the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of post-colonial, very critical texts written on that in the 1950s and 1960s, showing that actually some of them even claim that the Soviet Union was not socialist, it was state capitalist. And that is an interesting thing also to discuss. Yet I cannot agree with the idea that we should revamp the Soviet symbols. And maybe for me, because I grew up in the Soviet Union and half of my life went there, you know, I cannot deal with that. And I do think that all those millions of lives that were sacrificed for that regime are, I mean, we cannot just ignore them. So it's important to kind of, I think, make this difference between Soviet symbols and socialism or Marxism even as such. And you're right, of course, Mahira, when you say that a lot of decolonialists started as Marxists, actually. Yeah, if we look at Dussel, if we look at Quijano, the main decolonial figures, they started with Marxism, but they didn't stop there. I mean, at least some of them, because Dussel, yes, he stopped there. But Quijano didn't. And I think that he became decolonial when he connected more with indigeneity in Latin America. So the moment, for me, I mean, I'm not saying that you have to believe that or agree with me, but for me, decoloniality starts precisely at the moment when Soviet Union collapses and the Cold War ends. And when this larger myth of a possibility of a wonderful, just society that all leftists shared at that point, and still do sometimes, even today. So when that collapsed, and it became clear that, as I think Walter Mignola wrote in one of his books recently, the state cannot be democratized and the state cannot be decolonized. So that is it's a clear realization, okay, yeah, we've been post-colonial for a while, but it's clear that post-colonial states are neo-colonial in reality. They don't bring really freedom or equity or anything. And it cannot be democratized, as this collapse of the state socialist system also demonstrated. So at this very dark moment in the early 90s, when there is this defeat of the global left, then decolonial Marxists come up with an alternative vision. And that's why then in the early 90s, they say, okay, we cannot do anything about the state. We cannot make a revolution. We cannot really hope for any good moves in the future. So let's concentrate on epistemologies. Let's concentrate on aesthetics. So it's not because they believe that it's better, but it's because it was at that moment of defeat when neoliberalism became global. And at that point, of course, it looked like it's forever going to stay. Now we know that probably not, because we see the cracks and we see how it's collapsing right now in front of us. And maybe we will even see something different in our lives. But at that point, it was Fukuyama all over saying it's the end of history. And from now on, it will be just neoliberalism for everyone. Like we reached this wonderful paradise of the consumer society. So in that sense, I think that decoloniality shouldn't be seen as some kind of, God that we pray to and we just learn and then we apply it in Central Asia or in Africa or else. No, it's a living thing. It's changing and it's remade by us, doing this, doing activism, doing research with people, not on people, of course. And for me, that is a very interesting element. In decoloniality, so that it's not frozen, it should not be frozen and given once and for all, and it should always be contextualized and seen historically, not as a universalist discourse that is kind of given us, to us by God, but as something that we do and redo and remake and recreate and reimagine ourselves. And in that sense, I think that all of the presentations were super interesting and potentially leading to really interesting work. But I would be also interested to see how you intersect and how you may become more into dialogue with each other and come up with these, questions and possible answers, like how do I understand decoloniality or decolonial feminism? Does it matter? Do we need to apply it anywhere at all? Or maybe this, model of application is also kind of modern colonial. Maybe we should just start with the reality that we have at hand there, the social world, the cultural world of people, the cosmologies, the cosmotechnologies there, and then see what sort of kind of theorizing or conceptualizing comes from there. Oh, this is just an idea, of course. I'm not, forcing you to believe in that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Madina. We will leave the floor to Rose for her discussion, and then we, Diana and Moira and Nega, you could react and answer if there are questions. Thank you.
Thank you, all of us, for this wonderful. Do you hear me? Okay. Oh yeah, to this wonderful panel, I learned a lot about post-Soviet country history and experiences. I will start how Madina stops about this interesting historicizing emergence of decolonial theoretical frame. It was very interesting to hear that historicizing from that perspective about how it's linked with socialist and Marxist theoretical frame and how it's linked with the collapse of the URSS. And the idea also that the decoloniality cannot be frozen, and I totally agree with that, that it cannot be frozen, it needs to be contextualized, to be recreated, depending on the context, depending on how research, depending on how positionality. I thought that I see many bridges in all your reflections here about decolonizing as being deeply involved in academia, but decolonization also, as a process which is always you're always working on, a kind of reflexive permanent process about how you do your research, how are your own practices, what do you think and why do you think in that way. That means that you have to historicize yourself, your own experiences, your own trajectory too, because that have an influence on how you think and what you think. And that was very interesting to see how this different perspective you show us from your own positionality, geographies, etc. I take not in a kind of messy way, so it's not very well structured myself. I also your thought also made me think about tradition, modernity. You can find in all colonial system, because in Africa too, when French or Britain came to colonize, it was about civilizing, because we African people were thought as barbaric and that kind of thing. And the fact that we have to interrogate what is tradition and how people behave and how we we think it's tradition and not tradition, and that all those things make me think about the kind of subaltern speak of Spivak, which I understand as the fact that, well, once the Western lenses design tradition as a kind of archaic way, if you stop with that interpretation of tradition, you cannot see agency local people can find through tradition. You know, when Spivak described these women who abandon themselves, and etc., and all people read it like she's a tradition, as it was a political act. So maybe this woman act traditionally, but because that this was his only way to have a political agency, and if you cannot, if you are not able to see beyond that, this binarity like tradition, archaism versus modernism, civilization, you cannot. There is many act behaviors you cannot like properly interpret, analyze as act of resistance, as political act, etc., and that was very interesting to hear about how we all, like, I think we all wondering about this category, which is very binary, whereas I don't know in your society, but I think it's the same. Like in Africa, there was more fluidity. There was more flexibility. So and what the colonial contact made is like fixed category, and then hierarchize what was like more, you know, more flexible. Like one day you can be marginalized, another day you can be the oppressor, and that make me also come with the thing of positionality and the thing of where did I miss it? The thing of I don't remember. I think it's Diana or Moklira who talk about communist legacy and how you deal with that thing, and that made me think about, you know, positionality, the fact that sometimes you can be the victim, but sometimes you can be oppressive, depending on context, depending on, and that things make me think that when we are from colonized society, we have to the most challenging thing is think critically, but with complexity, and see how, for example, women use some colonial rules to emancipate, even if we can think that globally colonization enhance women's subordination. You see, that's kind of, you know, space where you have to see some details who can bring more nuance in your think and something like that. And I also want to talk about the thing about decolonizing knowledge and knowledge production, because this reflection sometimes for me is kind of tricky, because, you know, I'm Cameroonian, I'm still Cameroonian citizen. I was being raised and born and raised in Cameroon partly, and then finished my raising in France, and then moving to Canada. And so I am very interested about decolonizing knowledge, about decolonizing how we disseminate knowledge, but I'm doing it from Western perspective, since I'm working in Western perspective, and it's how we can, even being in Western perspective, how we can still criticize it, and how we can also see how it allows us in some ways to do what we're doing. because since for example, I'm really critical about Cameroonian regime, and I know that if I was there, I will not be able, I think, to be as much criticized right now. And it's that complexity of how positionality, which is very interesting and which we have to think about, interrogate, and relentlessly. For example, in Cameroon, nationalists were banned in the country since 1955 until like 1990s. But they were banned in Cameroon, but also in France. But what was tricky is that they have the possibility to organize in clandestinity in France, where their life were not in threat, whereas in Cameroon they were like just killed or sent in prison and jailed. You see, and that's make us think about how the center is always it's at the same time oppressive, and at the same time it allows us to have some tiny spaces to organize resistance or things like that. And yeah, and to finish, I just want to finish with what I think Mokura said about acknowledging hybridity and as a way to resist, as a way to build liberation activity, to reinterpret our past and reappropriate our past to imagine the future. Because I think when that's what is important for people like me who are, circulating, because when you're circulating, you're like, even when you're local, you have kind of hybridity, but when you're circulating, you have more hybridity, because you take from every space you've been, and that space shape you too. So how can you deal with that when you're building a kind of decolonial theoretical or practice frame? So thank you again for allowing me to discuss with you about that. And what I want to ask you about, all of you, is about the fact that when we think critically, and we have to, keep, as I said, this fluidity, this flexibility in mind, do you think that, because I'm really, for years, I'm kind of taking my distance with that universal thing, and I'm feel more engaged toward pluriverse. So I think that this critical talk about pluriversality, pluriverse, can allow us to see the complexity of different form of liberty, different form of resistance, but also different form of oppression. So I want to know if this makes sense for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. Who wants to speak, answer first? Miguel, Diana, Mira.
Yeah, I guess I can start. Yeah, thanks to both of you for these really great comments. And Medina, I found like this idea of like mushrooming really interesting. I kept thinking about the anthropologist Anna Tsing and the emergence of like all these ideas. And I think you're right. We come from like very different perspectives, and I really like how you challenged us to potentially think about like bringing together these different ideas, and maybe this is something we should do. I guess, Rose, yeah, maybe in response to what you said about Madina about Linda Turai-Smith and the very difference between like, yeah, I think I completely agree with this idea that she comes from a different period than the Latin American scholars who think about decolonization and decoloniality equally, and she's like an indigenous scholar. And I think there is a lot of confusion generally, but also like a desire maybe to just like break up some of the barriers of separating indigenous scholars from decolonial scholars. And I mean, she speaks clearly about decoloniality, and I think what you say about like her concepts and her approach not being applicable, really interesting, because I found in her work lots of resonance with lots of things that I've done personally who are not at all with concepts of indigeneity, and especially like with her idea of like reparation and healing. That really goes beyond this idea of like making the others participate in our work. So like really the responsibility of like creating another reality and trying to think about healing as part of the work of scholars. I don't have like a framework, a timeline, a solution. But I think that this is very inspiring, and also in my own teaching, a really interesting provocation for students who are writing their dissertations or writing their thesis and being like, what does it mean to be doing something else than just like telling the story and having this healing in mind? And I think this is applicable to, for me, this is applicable to any situation, and not only like in my work on Central Asia, it's also applicable to, for me, in thinking, a part of my work is on migration in France, starting to think about that and thinking about like recovery and healing as like part of this. Rose, thank you for these like really interesting comments. I think it's so interesting that you come from like another like regional area and like so many overlaps. I really liked what you said about this idea of just this still being a process of like historicizing ourselves. I think it really makes sense to me. So thanks so much for bringing that up. In response to your question about like what we think about the notion of pluriversality, I feel like really excited, and I really agree. I think it's so relevant as well to our necessity to challenge, especially when we're speaking about in the context of like French, a webinar organized by the IFEAC and Institut du Genre. And I think it's so important to actually really deeply challenge this notion of universality and thinking about like pluriversal words. I feel limited. And I think the limitation that I feel is related to this question of like voice and the politics of voice that I try to mention also in the presentation about, there is a moment where like doing research is about, there is no other way than like, there is a process of translation of a voice, or if you don't want to appropriate, there is a process of translation. And hence I, in my own work, feel like really probably incapable of doing that in the Central Asian context. I feel much more able to do that when I think about my own work on migration and childhood in France. And this is for me where it stops, where like actually there is a real limitation in like positionality in what, as someone who is not Central Asian, who hasn't grown up there, doesn't have like necessarily roots there, almost shouldn't speak about this. I don't know if that makes sense. At the same time, I keep thinking about Linda Turai-Smith saying that she, it's not because you research is related to forms of violence that we shouldn't do it. But yeah, well, I wanted to voice this limitation, I guess.
Thank you, Moira or Diana. Do you want to react?
Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to both of the discussants for really interesting comments. Yeah. In response to Madina's remarks, I guess. What I was responding to is not, the ideas of decolonial feminists or decolonial thought, but I was responding to how it's been appropriated and interpreted in the context of gender activism and in feminist circles in my kind of work and in interactions, but also in a lot of academic discussions lately. Things that I have written and said have been kind of reappropriated to advance kind of nativist agendas, which I resent deeply. So it wasn't to say that that's how I understand decolonial thought. And in response to what was said about this like static understanding of tradition, I absolutely agree that tradition is it's always kind of a political speech act. So the person who claims that something is a tradition or is not a tradition is trying to advance a certain political agenda, and then they're trying to claim a certain kind of authority and a position from which to speak. Absolutely, these very static ideas about culture and tradition are in themselves very colonial, and it's this colonial gaze that kind of doesn't allow a person to be creative in the present, right? So they always have to correspond to some ideas like stereotypes and caricatures of what it means, to be Tajik or Uzbek or Central Asian. This idea of hybridity, fluidity, flexibility, the curdling, they all appeal to me very much. I'm also excited about this idea of like plurality and complexity. Speaking about like where our work intersect, it's also a work in progress. So Lucia, Diana, and I are co-editing a collection of texts on critical gender and then sexuality studies in Central Asia. So we have a circle and we meet every month, and we discuss work of it's a circle now of over 20 people, and it's been a really great experience, kind of seeing how our thinking is evolving together, and oftentimes we disagree on a lot of things, and we kind of enrich each other's work. So it's coming. And hopefully something comes out of this process, which in itself was designed to be more kind of participatory and in this kind of feminist ethic of co-production and co-creation. So
Thank you.
I'll be
Diana.
brief. I'll be brief in terms of like, I didn't mention my positionality in the beginning, but I guess the way I looked at the question itself and at the way of this was planned in advance was that reflecting on the discussions that are going in the field. So I don't think I was presenting precisely the arguments that are formed already in my writing, although like the regime is of course central to me in terms of understanding how power relations work. But the two things I brought up were tradition and civilized approach, which I find really intriguing, that it's not about tradition and modernity, it's about tradition and civilized, is very interesting because I'm reflecting the debate that is ongoing in the field itself. In Kazakhstan, precisely because I thought, like, you know, it's important to navigate it in this particular talk, because I knew that Mohira will be speaking about Kyrgyzstan and maybe broadly about Central Asia, and that Nigara would talk about her fieldwork in Tajikistan. I thought it would be better to do it like that. But also I think it, how to say, what I'm trying to do, and what I tried to do in this talk was to really demonstrate that there's so much going on right now with even the concept itself of decolonial. So for example, I think that for a very long time, Central Asian studies tried to kind of like almost apply and see how the framework of post-colonial works within the context. And then they kind of like became disappointed with it because they saw that it's not fruitful. And then all of a sudden this decolonial problem is brought up, this openness, fluidity, interesting approach. And again, and I completely agree with Martina, it's the way people understand it. And it's not my place to tell them and sort of lecture them and say, well, look at Maria Lugones or look at Walter Mignolo. Although thankfully Martina's book was published in Russian in Almaty, and a lot of people find it very, very useful to sort of like, you know, navigate these different theoretical debates. But I think it's about this openness. And what's interesting to me is that I approach this openness from very diverse points of view. So I have like a study on social movements and how they view decolonizing perspective. I study contemporary art and look into what's decolonial and how do they perceive it. And I wanted to present some, you know, exhibition today, but I thought, like, you know, maybe not, because it's really looking into that idea of memory and trauma, which is again slightly different. But it's their way of looking at it. And who am I, or who is anyone to tell them that they're wrong or right in what they're perceiving. So I think, and this kind of like the debates I wanted to bring is just to highlight the nodal points, both on an idea of sexuality and body, which I think is very, very intriguing and interesting to me particularly. I'm really interested in the embodiment, but also this idea of, again, traditional, and what does it mean traditional? I completely agree with Rose that for a lot of women and for a lot of men, it doesn't really matter about the gender, tradition is this idea of, like, you know, gaining a specific agency, gaining specific political subjectivity, gaining specific power as well within the context of both colonial, post-colonial, whichever you define the type of reality. And they definitely use it. And that's why I didn't want to go beyond Kazakhstan itself, because I think if we're going and comparing, like, you know, Kazakhstan to Uzbekistan, in Uzbekistan itself is a very diverse place of where you can go and which types of discourses and ideas and debates you will start, you know, engaging with. If you go to even different parts of Tajikistan, there will be another different story and so on. So I think Central Asia in itself, in the past 30 years, has developed so distinctly that, you know, what we are trying to do, I think, and that's where our intersection might be, or the connection can be based, is that we're really reflecting on this complexity on the ground. I can't find a better word for that, but the very much, you know, what Central Asia, I guess, tried to represent itself in some of these kind of like going back to the authentic nature approaches as this very diverse and often contradictory space of different meanings and different discourses and ideas. And I guess, and that's why I'm such a, you know, I have very much problematic approach to trying to navigate it and place it within a very coherent narrative of sort of saying like Central Asia the same. It's not. When you are on the ground, when you travel from one city to another, it doesn't matter whether it's a borderland, whether it's like, you know, within the same state or within the same territoriality and so on and so forth, under the jurisdiction of the same regime. It's a very distinct experience and practice. So what I tried to do in my presentation was trying to, which is kind of counterproductive, trying to contain it within the debates of what is defined as Kazakhstani decolonial debates, but then to show that within these debates there are very diverse and very contradictory discussions, where, as I said, some people do view traditionalists as negative, but then other people are saying, well, it's not negative, it's actually positive. So let's not complain about daughters-in-law, and let's not complain about mothers-in-law. Don't shame our shame, bring back the real authentic understanding of Yacht and so on and so forth. I'm really intrigued by these debates because it's you know, that's how, you're right, that's how people claim their subjectivity, but also that's how they believe they're claiming some sort of either power or, epistemological power, whatever that they feel that they have lost. And I think
that's something also very, very important, that there's this very ambiguous understanding of loss that unites a lot of them, that we also need to pay attention to. So in that sense, I think I didn't really try to, because I think it would be fruitless to take a particular theoretical or conceptual framework and try to see whether it works in Central Asia, because we've been there. But on the other hand, I'm really following Michael Billig's latest book, How to Write Badly, where he says, but what's the point of inventing other concepts? So I'm also like Mohira, I'm a little bit like, in this existential crisis. Do we create new concepts? Do we create new, theories precisely for Central Asia, or do we engage in debates? And maybe actually looking into this, what I prefer to call complexity, and this very interesting, I don't know, bottomless perspective of different meanings that can be also called a pluriversal approach, is the answer for what we're doing here. But my attempt was really to reflect and look into why these contradictions and critiques and these debates precisely about sexuality and again, a traditionalist versus civilized immersion, what do they tell about the types of debates that are ongoing and on the ground? So that's it for me.
Thank you, dear colleagues. Now, if you agree, I'd like to ask you the questions that were written on the chat. So we have a question from by Alexa Kurmanov, who says, thank you for this amazing discussion. My question is about the distinction between post-colonial and decolonial feminisms. Do the panelists see them as completely separate or overlapping, blurred, entangled? Where do you see differences, similarities between the two? Classical question, but it is always interesting to go back to these questions, in my point of view. And then Philippe Lotolz, thank you too, Philippe, who says, thank you for the great talks and sharing. A lot was said about culturally specific concepts and narratives of patriarchy and coloniality, of shame, exploitation, reproductive and family values. So did any of you, come across specific, some would say vernacular concepts in the societies and communities you're working with, which resonate with ideas of resisting coloniality or even with decoloniality? And if you don't mind, I have my own question. I have a question about the place of the state, generally multicultural. Do you think that it remains an indispensable scale, a priority for setting up decolonial analysis in context? I want to precise my question. Does contextualizing necessarily mean for you to specify political regimes at the scale of the state? In other words, how does the colonial analysis in your own investigations take into account the historicity of political regimes? How can colonial and imperialist practices change according to the regimes? I don't know, democracy, authoritarianism, totalitarianism that shape them. I say that because if decoloniality begins, as Marina said, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I think it's very, very interesting idea. It is not only about the traces of feudalism and its continuities as we can study them in Latin America, for example, but on this continuous succession of different political regimes. Thank you very much. So I'm sorry, I had also my own questions. So we have three questions. Who do you want to react? Who wants to react?
Sure, I'm happy to start. Alexa, thanks for your question. It's such a big question. I feel like it could take an entire seminar or lecture, whatever. But the way I understand it really in a nutshell is, so postcolonialism has like such a longer history that can be traced to also the cultural and the discursive turn. And I think for me, the way I see it, the difference, well, there are definitely overlaps. There is definitely a building of decolonial thinking and postcolonialism. I think for me, what really marks the difference, and it doesn't mean that people who identify as postcolonial scholars do not do that, but it's a move from a more like critique and deconstruction, and from this to something that looks more at questions of transformation. And I think thinking about epistemic violence and erasure as being like some of the core concepts of some postcolonial scholars, of Spivak, etc., and moving from this to the idea of like epistemic disobedience, for instance, from Mignolo, as being like encompassing this idea of just like completely changing our understanding of the world and bringing up a transformation and a healing, is something that I see some as very differentiating postcolonialism and decolonialism. When we think about feminism in particularly, and postcolonial feminism and decolonial feminism, I think what a decolonial feminism brings is like the understanding also of gender and the coloniality of gender as being historicized, but as being also existing in the present moment and reproduced through heteropatriarchal and racist systems that are also related to capitalism. Really in a nutshell, and I apologize for this not being like more precise. I don't know if like the others want to answer this question, or if I should try to carry on with the others, or I don't know how you want to proceed. Philippe, I think that was a great question, and I read it and I was like, has that ever happened to me? And this is interesting because I don't think that, I can't recollect people really mentioning concepts that were related to forms of coloniality. There were mentions of like form of experience of violence, especially when people were speaking about the history of their place during the Soviet Union and forms of hierarchies and feeling inferior. And if we think about like forms of, but there is, the thing that is interesting is like this kind of ambivalence in speaking in historical terms about the Soviet presence in Tajikistan and with people I spoke with, between this idea of togetherness and friendship that is really present, as if people were repeating a narrative that has been repeated to them like again and again. So this, and a real belief also, and a form of nostalgia on one hand, and on the other hand, also recognitions of forms of like exclusions and violence. And so people don't mention colonialism per se or decoloniality when they speak about the Soviet past, well, in the villages where I spoke with people. But there is a real notion of like this form of ambivalence that I think is what stayed with me, and Lucia and I try to bring up in our co-authored work. And I guess, Delphine, the last question about political regimes and the state, and like this moment of, I think that's a really interesting question. And what came to my mind spontaneously was like how this idea of like actually tradition has been operationalized by the state in Tajikistan. And I think probably the people who are best placed to speak about it here are probably Lucia, and I saw that Juliette was in the and other people. I mean, I know that Moira and Diana, you've also contributed to this work, but this idea of also revisiting this idea of the nation, using elements of the past and reinventing tradition, I think can really be related to like the place of the state in reinvoking like this idea of independence by also just like reinventing tradition. So yeah, definitely. Okay, I'll stop here then.
Maybe, yeah, I'd like to also respond to Philip's question. To me, one of the strongest metaphors that originates in the Soviet literature, it's a book by Chingiz Aytmatov, The Day Lasts More Than 100 Days. is this persona, or like the figure of Mankurt, right? So it's become part of also everyday language that people use to refer to this colonial Soviet experience of somebody's basically whole humanity being transformed in a way that Mankurt is a person who is enslaved and tortured, and they basically are made to forget their past. So to the degree that this character in the book doesn't recognize his mother and kills his mother, right? So Mankurt has become this very strong image and like the metaphor that is used oftentimes to decry this legacy, this experience, but also to label the people who are perceived as not properly, authentically native. Like it's the way that in like a lot of this nationalist discourse, for instance, Kyrgyz people who are Russian speakers are referred to as Mankurt, right? And I've been thinking about it, and like this also kind of refers to my experience when I was literally like called a monster by my own grandfather, because he said like he said like you and my brother, like you are urode, right? So like you are basically monstrosities because like you don't speak Tajik, but he was saying that to us in Russian, and that was the only language of socialization that we experienced as children. So I mean, I just I'm thinking in terms of these kind of, it's not like self-affirming language that people use, right? It's what you get labeled, but I'm seeing here a potential for like appropriation of this language, in a way that, for instance, the word queer was reappropriated. So it used to be a slur, an offensive word, and then it became kind of the way that oppressed people refer to themselves in a positive way. So yeah, I'm just really interested in investigating further this idea of like monstrosity as a type of impurity, right? And yeah, like this kind of resistance to these phantasms of purity and unity and control. So that's my only reflection. I'm sorry if I'm a bit rambling. It's like late for me, and I've had a full working day, so I'm not the sharpest at the moment. So.
Thank you, Mohira. Diana, do you want to react, or anybody want to react now? Because I think, yes, we are going to conclude. It is 10:15 in Bishkek, so it is very late. Thank you very much for the person who worked so late. And so Lucia, maybe you want to a few words for conclusion?
Just to thank you all of you again. And as Moira said, it's ongoing discussion. We hope that we will publish the results of not only us, but a lot of scholars working on this issue the next year. So thank you again, and see you very soon.
Adrien, thank you, Lucia. Adrien, you want to
Well, thank you so much. Just a short word. I guess it helped us all to think critically about our positionality, at least for myself. That was really, really stimulating. So thank you again.
Thank you to all of you for your information. We have a new seminar in June. We have not defined yet the schedule. You will be able to see the information on the Gender Institute website. I have written the websites of IFEAC and Gender Institute on the chat. Thank you again very much. It was very stimulating. And as Yusuf said, see you soon. Bye-bye.